I'm going to begin by asking one question and perhaps a supplemental just to make these panelists feel nostalgic for the legislature. Open-ended question, David, top of mind thoughts about the results of the Canadian election.
Well, I think what it indicated was the indecision the country had about who they really wanted to lead this country. When you look at it, when we started the campaign, if you look at the polls at the very beginning of the campaign, two-thirds of Canadians wanted a change in PM. They were asked, is it time for change? Two-thirds said yes. So you think, well, that's probably an election where you'd expect to have change at the top. At that point, the Conservatives and the Liberal Party were splitting the popular vote, roughly the same percentage. The Conservatives had a lead, but between the two of them, they had about 70% of the popular support. And by the end of the campaign, the level of support for the two main parties that were going to have any chance of governing had dropped. It had dropped from about 70% to somewhere in the order of 66, 67. I don't know the final tally, which is, it's not disastrous, but it's an indication that they were sort of dead in the water. So what happened in the campaign? The rebirth of the bloc. I think that's a terrible result for Canada. I mean, to have a separatist party who made it clear during the campaign they were not there for Canada, they were there for Quebec. And Mr. Blanchette made that quite clear. That's not a great development for this country. So I think clearly Canadians, and we've done this before, if you look back in history, during the Diefenbaker era, for example, we had a succession of minority governments. It's not unheard of. Mr. Harper headed up a number of minority governments, or more than one. Number, I guess it was more like two. But in the end, though, so this isn't unusual. What is disappointing, though, is at a time when there are really some dark clouds appearing, that we would wind up in this situation.
David, thank you. John.
Well, I agree to some considerable extent with my friend's observation. I will amend it slightly by a couple of observations, but the election actually was, for me, the result was a surprise. I thought the seat totals would be closer together. I thought, in fact, I was in some poll the day before, friends of mine, some football poll, and I thought, because David's absolutely right, there has not been a federal election in a very long time where both national parties dropped to the extent that they did in this campaign. Now, the Liberals dropped about 6.5 points from where they were the last time, and they certainly dropped 5.5, I think, from where they were when the election began. The Conservatives actually, at the end of the day, edged up slightly. They ended up at 34% with about 1.5% lead in popular vote. But David's point is to have the two major parties together at 66.5% of the vote on election day is quite unusual. So that's one observation I would make in total agreement with David. Secondly, the country is clearly divided on a couple of really important issues. Climate change and the related energy environment issues most especially. Thirdly, I don't quite share David's view about the bloc in this sense. I thought, I'm going to sound a little self-congratulatory when I say this, but I was saying in the last 6 to 12 months to my friends, the conditions are forming to be very good for the bloc. Why was I saying that? The NDP was in collapse in Quebec. We knew that. And on election night, they elected one member when they had 16 elected in 2015 and 59 in 2011. And I remember, and I want to make this point because I couldn't get anybody interested. I said the bloc, and I thought the collapse of the NDP in Quebec and SNC. And I'll be quite blunt with you. I have my own views on SNC, and they're probably not very different than most of yours in the room. But I was talking over the course of the last 6 months to friends of mine in Quebec, very thoughtful, bright people, many of them les bleus, in politics. And I was struck by, it didn't have to go very far in that debate before I started to get some pushback saying, you know, this is starting in Quebec to sound like, dare I say it, a moralistic sermon yet again on business ethics coming out of Toronto, Winnipeg, and Calgary. And it's not being received quite as generously, I think, as it's being offered. So actually, one of the surprises for me on election night was that the Bloc only got 32 seats. I thought they might actually be more likely getting 40. One of the elections I heard nothing about in comparative terms in the election, and here I am being a bit of a pedant, this election had some real similarities, and I'm looking around the room, there's at least 3 or 4 people, one of them sitting to my immediate left, who will remember 1962. In 1962, the Diefenbaker government was in trouble, and the Liberals were gleeful. They thought, our ship has come in. We always said, Dief, for all his populist charm, couldn't run a government, and this will be the election to prove it. And the polling showed that, in fact, there was some truth to that. Except Dief got into the campaign, and unlike Trudeau the Younger in this campaign, Dief's vote went up. Didn't go up by a lot. He started the campaign, I think, at 35.5%, ended on election night 2 points higher at 37. The Liberals didn't get their government because a very colorful guy that you'd never heard of, named Réal Cahouette, won 26 seats in the Dominion election of June 18th, 1962, and the result on election night was Diefenbaker won 16, Mike Pearson 100, Creditist 26. And that didn't much change. The Creditist, Pearson never got a majority because a Quebec party got significant. They got something like 35–40% of the Francophone vote. It was not reported in the Tony parlors of Outremont and, dare I say it, the Annex in Toronto because, you know, it was, he wasn't on the Kennedy channel. He was on the Lyndon Johnson channel. And you had to be in the hinterland to see it develop. So the Bloc, I was not surprised. The surprise for me was that they didn't do better. And I think the good news in the campaign, and the result I want to quickly touch on, and I'll shut up, Alan, was the Conservatives, faced with the pressure from the Blocistes, actually held virtually all their seats in Quebec. One of the great legacies of Stephen Harper, not just to the Conservative Party, but to the country, is that he created, and they've been able to maintain, a significant base, and none of it's on the West Island. None of it is in Anglophone, Allophone Quebec. It's all in pure Lane country. And those seats all held, with maybe one exception, in this election. That is, for the longer term, I think a very good thing. The other thing I would observe, that in Quebec, I think it was a good thing that a Federalist Party, in this case the Liberal Party, could say when it was over, we actually got more seats than the Blocistes. The final thing I would say, as minority governments go, I don't share the view that, that this is quite as unstable as some people think. I have some experience with minority governments. My first 6 years in the legislature were minority governments, and I watched the very masterful William Davis, with the very able assistance of an extremely good House leader, recast that government in quite a good and productive way. But when I look at this result, I see this, for me, as federal minority parliaments go, is more pregnant with opportunity than most. Why do I say that? Because I see 4 ways that careful, attentive government with 157 seats can stay in office doing reasonable things for some time. 1, their obvious partner is the NDP. They need 13 seats to get to majority. The NDP have 24. They have no interest in an election. So that's option number 1. Option number 2 will be the Blocistes. There's 32 of them. They've actually got 2 ways to help. 1, the government can say we want to do some things in and for Quebec, and they can tailor that offering in a way where the Blocistes can support it. And as David says, and this is, I think, worrisome, and I agree, the idea, but democracy is democracy. They have a right to run, and they ran and won. They're a bit like the old Socrats. You know, Alberta, they're talking today that the Albertans have no Liberals. Well, there was a time, I think one of those elections, the Socrats, this is a few decades ago, they were all Socrats, and they had very interesting ideas about money that Bay Street didn't particularly like, and they basically took themselves out of federal presence in government in Ottawa. But the Blockists can do something else. The Blockists can do what the Liberals did as they were in bad shape in the middle of the Harper years. They can abstain. They just don't vote. People forget that. But opposition parties in minority governments, sometimes, they don't want to go up and they don't want to go down, so they go away. They just don't vote. Well, you need 170 to get a majority in this parliament, but if 32 Blockists decide we're not going to show up, and trust me, there will be votes where they do that, effective majority government is at 156. The Liberals have 157, and I can assure you that in a real pinch, that just might get them through the night. And more importantly, and finally, there are going to be issues, some of the toughest issues facing this parliament and government are going to be around the questions of energy and the environment, in the question of climate policy. And there are 157 Liberals and there are 121 Conservatives. And trust me, there will be 170 votes in that combination to get the government the measures it will require. So I can tell you, Trudeau, the elder in 1972, remember that? Remember the numbers in that? It was 109, 107, and one very, very well or focused NDP opposition led by David Lewis, who was no neophyte, and they made, the Liberals did. You may not have liked the results, maybe if you had a view on wage and price controls, but that would have been a tougher minority government and parliament to manage than this one. But Liberals in Ottawa have a reputation not always being as non-arrogant as it's very useful to be in minority environments. So we'll have to see how Trudeau the younger behaves. If he shows himself as adaptive as his father did 47 years ago, I don't see a reason why this parliament can't last at least 2 or 3 years absent a major external crisis or an internal scandal that just makes it impossible for sane people to support the government.
Thank you, Sean.